Well, I want to thank Dawn, Tim and the choir for the beautiful rendition that they gave earlier on. That was a real gift, the special music. And I know the choir really missing getting together, and I'm sure it was a great gift for everyone in the congregation to hear that. So thank you to all responsible for that. And thank you, Solveig, for your reflection. It's said that there's two types of people that like to come to church. There's those that like to come to church on a Sunday morning, and there's those who like to leave on a Sunday morning. And I understand that, but I want people who love coming to church and love leaving church. And I probably need to explain that because you might not be expecting the latter part of this. I think church on a Sunday morning and the worship service is the beginning of our path into a reflection. It's not the end. I hope you come and you get nourished and nurtured and refueled to go out into the world, to engage with life's struggles, to be the embodiment of love to our neighbours and our friends and our workmates, and to help us get through the challenges and joys. And I'm not naive. I know some days, even in Zoom, it's quite hard just to take the effort to log in and get online, because it might mean we need to brush our hair or get out of bed or get out of our pajamas. I understand that. And there's a story about this young man, and his mother wakes him up because he's late for church, and he goes, I don't want to go to church. He said, you have to go to church. He said, I don't want to go to church. He said, Mum said, why don't you want to go to church? He said, I don't like church. I don't like the people, and they don't like me. And his mother said, you have to go to church. And the son said, why do I need to go to church? And the mother said, you're the minister. That's not autobiographical, just so you know. But I do want to point out something I found out after I became a minister, that a group of alligators, do you know what the name for a group of alligators is? A congregation. That's the name for a group of alligators. And again, that's not been my experience, but they don't tell you that in seminary. They only tell you that once you become a minister, that a group of alligators is called a congregation. And having met most of you over the last couple of weeks, that's not the term I would use. Don't take any implication from that. But sometimes it's quite hard just to engage religious community. We've got a nighttime meeting, might be your third meeting of the week, maybe just got home from work, maybe there's an effort to drive because you live far away. It's hard, it's not easy to engage religious community. It's a commitment. But I hope it's a commitment that pays each of us back. And I really want to explore what is the essence of religious community. Why did you all gather here? Why have you been supporting UUFRC for years and years and years? Or why are you visiting UUFRC just over the last few months or a year? The Unitarian Universalist minister, he's retired now, Reverend Dick Gilbert, says, life is inconvenient, no doubt about it. It's messy. It is mystery wrapped in an enigma, surrounded by a quandary, all in the shape of a question mark. It's more often question than answer, more doubt than faith. It's defined by contradiction, paradox, ambivalence, and oxymoron. That is why human beings invented religion, to figure it all out. Well, I found that reading less than helpful. But Dick Gilbert has been a Unitarian Universalist minister for 44 years, so he must have learned something about this. And he's a fabulous minister, actually. But he's more optimistic than me. I don't think religious community is about where we come to figure it all out. And I'm sorry to disappoint you if that's what you were hoping that I'm here for. I don't think we're here to figure it all out. I think religious community is where we bring the messy complexity of our lives to be explored in a loving, caring, and supportive way. That, for me, is fundamental to religious community. But any community is defined by inclusion and exclusion. There's an idea of this kind of groupishness, that a religious community is defined by who can be part of it and who's not part of it. And that's the very essence of community. And that can be a real struggle for Unitarian Universalists who desire to be an inclusive community. And we have no creedal test. We have no profession of faith. We are a covenantal religion where we make promises of how we're going to be with one another. We are not a creedal religion. And one of our fundamental principles, one of the first principles, is this idea of the inherent worth and dignity of all people. Inherent worth and dignity of all people. And going back to the story I told about Hosea below, where universalism would put the love of all humanity at the center of religion. We value the worth of all people, and valuing the worth of someone is not saying we even like everyone. And it's not even saying that we love everyone. As I've said, during some of my meetings, we hold everyone in love as universalists, but some we hold further away than others. Because we can't like everyone, we can't love everyone equally, but we value everyone and we see their worth and we aspire to love them however we can. And I was very pleased in a lot of the meetings I had this past couple of weeks about the two things that you valued most from what I heard from most of you was the community that you have of gathering together and worship. And as your worship leader, that's a huge responsibility that you take that. And I think you've already got the community. And so hopefully I can bring inspiration and emotional connection to the worship services that we do. And I was also really excited when I first looked at the congregational packet, even before I applied, because your vision said a community of spiritual growth, compassion, and justice. That's what you want to become, a community of spiritual growth, compassion, and justice. And your mission, we are a welcoming and inclusive community of individuals of all ages who seek spiritual meaning, empower personal growth, build connections with our neighbours, act for justice, and inspire others to join us. That's the mission. That's what we try and do on a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis. And I love the fact you had spiritual meaning and spiritual growth in both your vision and mission. You'll be surprised at the number of UU churches that don't even mention spirituality. And even in our UU 7 principles, spiritual is only mentioned once. So you're already ahead of the 7 principles that we have. You mentioned it twice within 2 statements. And that's really exciting for a Unitarian Universalist congregation, because sometimes I think we are a little bit frightened to be religious. We're almost a little bit embarrassed about being religious or being spiritual. And I don't think we're doing ourselves any favor. And I really don't believe we're doing our world any favor, because I honestly believe the world would be a better place if our values, if our spirituality was more prevalent in the world around us. So you'll find I kind of do this a lot. I'm going to present you with a question I want you to take a few moments to reflect on. Take a moment in silence right now to reflect on what does it mean for you to be a community of spiritual growth, compassion, and justice? What does it mean to you for you to be a community of spiritual growth, compassion, and justice? I look forward to hearing your answers. Seriously. The Jewish thinker, Martin Buber, who was alive in the early 20th century, he says this: the real essence of a community is to be found in the fact that it has a center. The real beginning of a community is when its members have a common relationship to the center, overriding all other relations. The circle is defined by the radii, not by the points on the circumference. So what relationship do you have to this community through the center? Not the points in the circumference where you only know your next neighbor. What connection brings us together? I think that we can answer that through the vision, through the mission, through covenant, through the relationship, through the lived experiences we share with each other. That points to what the center of our religion that pulls us together. And I invite you to reflect on a continual basis about vision and mission, and what intentions do you have about being in relationship with one another? Because our covenant's a challenge. We do covenant about how to be with one another. And covenant has got many folds. We often think we are free to think of whatever, we're free in Unitarian Universalism to think whatever we want. And I don't agree with that. I don't think we can. You can think whatever you want in any community. We covenant about how we want to relate to one another, how we want to be in relationship with one another. So there's actually a tension there, because that actually, a covenant It's a promise about how we want to be accountable and responsible to one another. So it actually does a restriction on our freedom. And you mentioned in your mission statement being a covenant of individuals. But even that, we're limiting what, our freedoms as individuals to be part of a community. And we don't always realize that. And sometimes our covenant is great, right up until we need it when we're in disagreement with one another. And we can start, our relationship can start to fracture and we can neglect the covenant. So I want you to really think about, what does the covenant mean, not just with your freedoms, but your responsibility and your accountability to this community and to one another. And one of the big questions I asked you a couple of weeks ago was, or two questions, what do you love and what breaks your heart? Because I think those are rich sources of exploration. And I noticed Solveig did that in her reflection. She framed her exploration of what does she love and what breaks her heart. And I want to share with you a story that both demonstrated to me what do I love and what breaks my heart about religious community. When I was back a member of the San Francisco church, it was in 2003, a young man came and I met him. I was one of the first people he met. His name was Nathan Sistoni. And Nathan was a young 26-year-old. He was gregarious, he was friendly, and I was the first person he talked to. We got into a long conversation. And I must have been in my best behavior or else very quiet, because he showed up again the next week. And I got to know Nathan really well over the few weeks, and he was smart, he was intelligent, he was funny, he loved this religious community. And over time, I started to find out something of his background. And he was a transgender man. And at that time, I did not know any transgender people, and so I became quite close to him. And he'd been estranged from his mother and father for about 4 years. When he started going through his transition, he was rejected by his family. So he carried a lot of pain, but he was an incredibly optimistic and joyful person. And I remember one time I went up to him, we were looking for new worship associates. And I asked him, I said, I'd like you to be a worship associate. And he looked at me and he said, do you think the congregation's ready for a transgender worship associate? Or is that why you're asking me? Have you got an ulterior motive in asking me? I said, well, I'm asking you because you're smart, funny, and articulate, but I do have an ulterior motive. I'm 41 and I'm the youngest worship associate here, and I want a 26-year-old like yourself. And he laughed. Then he started to cry. And I was taken aback. I said, what did I say? I thought I'd said something wrong. And he said to me, he said, oh, that's what I love about this religious community. Sometimes I need to be reminded by my full humanity. Sometimes I need to be reminded of my full humanity. And that was really eye-opening for me, because it allowed how people with historically marginalized identities can often see that as the dominant part of themselves, and really having a community that sees all of us for our full humanity is really important. And we don't always get that. In our job, we're often seen for our function or our purpose. And so being seen for our full humanity, I think, is one of the essences of religious community. And I'd love to say the story is a happy ending, but I want to continue on with the story. About 6 months later, after that conversation, I was sitting in my office at the time, and I got a phone call from the minister, Reverend John Robertson, who was the interim minister at the San Francisco church at the time, to tell me Nathan had been killed in a car accident. He was actually killed on Millbrae Avenue on 101, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And he was hit by a car going in the wrong direction, a car going southbound in the northbound lane of 101, and he died almost instantly. And we were all devastated, because Nathan had become a much loved part of the community. And Reverend John Robertson asked me, he said, Nathan was supposed to be giving the reflection this Sunday. Would you be willing to read it with a couple of other of his friends? And it was, of course, it was an honor. Nathan had already sent it. And we read his reflection that Sunday morning. And you could imagine what it was like 5 or 6 days later, reading the words of this person, this member of our community who we really loved, who we really valued, and we're reading these words of his. And it was so hopeful and so optimistic. And he talked about how just a week prior to his death, he had reconciled with his mother. And so he was so hopeful. He was in a great place in life. He had a religious community that loved him. He was reestablishing his relationship with his mother who loved him. You know, his professional career was going well, and it was taken like that. And I remember leaving that worship service, you know, moved by his words, but also sad at his loss. I remember I got home that Sunday and I read the newspaper report of his death. And I remember reading it, and I came to the very end. And I was just, my anger was just triggered because it said the coroner identified Nathan as a woman. And he had always appeared, you know, he identified, he honored himself as a man. That's who he was. That was his essence of who he was. And to see that made me angry. And I made a pledge at that time that I was going to do all I can as a straight white man to support the transgender community. Because I think the transgender community it certainly was 15 years ago, and it certainly is now. It's one of the most historically marginalized community. Even within Unitarian Universalism, I think many of us struggle to really embrace the transgender community. And even amongst the whole struggle of the Black Lives Matter movement over the last years, really, but especially over the last couple of weeks, the transgender community has even been marginalized within it. I remember when I've led transgender remembrance services, 75% of the people murdered were trans women of color. And even in this last week, Rhea Milden and Dominique Fells were trans Black women who were murdered this last week. And did we hear about it in the news? I'm not sure many of us did. So I am fully supportive of the idea of Black Lives Matter, but unless we can really address Black transgender women's lives matter, if we can do that, then we are really addressing the discrimination, the injustice in our world. And so I make that pledge that when I encounter anyone who is different from me, I need to learn from them. I need to listen to them, and I need to be an advocate in partnership with them. And I think if we can really address the marginalization, the discrimination, and the violence faced by trans women of color, then we can move into real justice in this world. And if we really want to be that religious community of love, justice, and compassion, that needs to be one of our goals moving forward as a religious community. Reverend Mark Morrison Reed, a retired African-American Unitarian Universalist minister, says the central task of religious communities is to unveil the bonds that bind each to all. There's a connectedness, a relationship discovered amidst the particulars of our own lives and lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. The church assures us that we are not struggling for justice on our own, but as members of a larger community. The religious community is essential, for alone our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen. Our strength is too limited to do all that must be done. Together our vision widens and our strength is renewed. So as a welcoming and inclusive community of individuals, we're pursuing our own search for meaning, and our religious community can help us find our meaning and find our purpose in life. And I want to explore a seventh principle here as well, and I want to explore it in a slightly different way. The seventh principle is a respect for the interdependent web of all existence. And we tend to think of community being a point in time, like this worship service right now, this Zoom session right now. But I want us to think about the interdependent web of all existence across generations as well, because ultimately that will be the legacy that each of us will leave. And there's a fabulous idea that's really kind of shifted my whole thinking around this. I discovered many years ago. It's by the Norwegian Quaker sociologist Elise Boulding. And she talks about the long presence or the 200-year now. The long presence or the 200-year now. And I love that idea. And one of the ways I've tried to interpret that for myself is to think of the hand of the oldest person you've touched who influenced you. And think of the hand of the youngest person whose hand you've touched that you'll influence. Think about that in your life. And when I think about that in my life, one of the oldest persons that influenced me was my maternal grandmother. And she was born the 1st of January, 1900. And I thought that was so cool because every year, the same year was her age. I really hoped she would make it to the year 2000 so she could be 100 years old. But she died at 93, which was a pretty good run, really. And I think what she lived through the First World War as a teenager. She lived through the Depression. She lived through the Second World War. And her husband was a coal miner. She lived in a small coal mining village. And you can imagine coal mining in the early Britain in the early 20th century in Britain was a tough life. Her husband died in the 1950s. So she was widowed for the last 33 years of her life. And it was a tough life. Now, I'd love to say my gran was this kind, compassionate individual. She was not. She was racist. She was sexist. She was a, Protestant Catholic bigotry. She was very bigoted towards Catholics. I would even describe her as sexist. She was one of the people who stopped my mum going to college, my mum being valedictorian of a high school. So, she was not the best person in the world, but she loved me, and I knew she loved me. And I knew she had a hard life, and I can't really condemn her for all the things she lived through, the hard life. She was still making coal fires at the age of 90 years old. Her home was heated by a coal fire. She refused to get anything else. But she did have a hard life. But I realized, I look at her being born in 1900. My mother was born 1930. I was born 1962. My daughter was born 2003. If my daughter has a child, it's a good chance she will live till 2100. So that's the 200-year now that I think we influence. And I love that idea. So I see I'm not the end of evolution. I'm not the destination of history. I am but a link in the chain. And my goal is to stop those values of racism and transphobia and sexism and all those other isms that limit our love and limit justice in our society, and pass on the best of those values to future generations. And I love that idea of just seeing ourselves as a link in the chain. Think how that would change how we view the planet, how we view climate change. If we start looking at things in a 200-year now or a long presence and seeing that we are just a link in the chain and not the end of it. And I would ask us to think, what would that mean for a religious community? UUFRC is 61 years old. So that's saying our influence will carry on for another 139 years. That's 2,159. Can you believe that what we're doing now will impact 2,159? How does that shift our thinking? How does that shift the changes that we want to do now and as we engage in long-term issues? And I ask you to look at your own family. Look at the 200-year now from your perspective. And I don't mean just your family. Think of this religious community, because we're an intergenerational community. So that means we don't just influence our children or influenced by our parents. We all influence each other. We can influence the children now who are 3, 4, 5 years old, and think of the influence they'll have in their 200-year now and their long presence. And I also want us to think of the children as our present. They're not our future. They're our very present. And I got this, when I was my previous congregation to one I serve now at San Marcos, I was having a conversation with this 8-year-old boy, and I can't remember the context of it, but I remember his reply. I said to him, what do you think the heart's for? And he said, the heart is to pump love through the body. The heart is to pump love through the body. And I was blown away by that. And you think of, you think of religious community, and I like to stretch that metaphor in this. Think of religious community as this community to pump love through each of us and pump love through the wider community and pump love into our world. I love that image of the heart to pump love through the body, through the life, through our neighborhoods and through the community. So the essence of religious community, yes, it's spirituality, yes, it's the community. And I think ultimately it's to provide both that social and spiritual support in times of hardship like we're going through now. Love is expressed how we want to aspire to be in relationship with one another, desire to be an inclusive religion, embracing those of a difference, not because of from a perspective of tolerance, because of a source for spiritual growth and a love for all humanity. And then also to transcend the disappointment and hardship and struggles in our life, to find hope and inspiration, and to propagate those values across the generations, to take the best of our religion from before and propagate it through the generations in our community, in our families, and our neighborhoods for the future. That, to me, is the essence of religious community. We are an intergenerational community. Let's recognize that and then start looking, how do we want to influence the next 100 years and what can we learn from the last 100 years? And let's us always do it by centering Hosea Ballou as a young child who said, this putting love of all humanity at the center of our religion and using that to connect with one another, to connect through the generations, to connect with the world around us.